Good morning, everybody. We're right at 10 o'clock. I appreciate everybody coming in right on time. I still have a few coming in through the waiting room, so I'm going to give it a couple moments and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Okay, looks like the waiting room has slowed down, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our stakeholder meeting for the CETA Capacity Expansion Study. This is the third of 4 meetings leading up to a draft report due to the PUC by September 1st this fall. My name is Kathy Boyce. I am Director for the Interior West at GridWorks, and I'm here with my coworker, Deborah Shields, to provide facilitation support to the Energy Strategies Modeling team. We are recording this meeting and we'll be sharing the file and posting it on the CETA website, so please know that it will be publicly available. So I'm going to drop the agenda into the chat for you and hand the floor over to Keegan and team to go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Morning, everybody. Let's see. So I've got a similar set of slides to open with for this third stakeholder meeting. So this is just some additional reminder background on what the study is trying to achieve. So this should be pretty familiar to most of you by this point. I think we've shown this slide 3 meetings in a row now. But here's what we're doing today. We're the first thing that we're going to do is that John Muse from our team, who's led the capacity expansion modeling, is going to share kind of where the reference case expansion plan ended up. We shared a draft expansion plan at the last stakeholder meeting and a draft bus bar mapping. Had some email communication with stakeholders after that, and then we finally landed on a final reference case resource portfolio in associated bus bar mapping that we've been using to perform the transmission analysis. But John's going to recap that process, which will be helpful and kind of put a bow on that. Just a quick addendum. We received a lot of really good feedback in the second stakeholder meeting on our approach, and then subsequent feedback from stakeholders through email and written communication, and we're really appreciative of that. And we think we ended up for a pretty in a pretty reasonable place here for the resource plan. So thanks for that help. In addition, there's 2 scenarios that we're performing that rely on, I guess, sensitivities around the capacity expansion modeling. One of those scenarios envisions some of Colorado.
Sorry, Keegan, we lost you. Can you?
Yeah, I was muted. It doesn't work very well if somebody mutes me.
No, there's we're yep. If you're not talking, if I could ask you to please mute.
You can mute everybody but me. So if we revisit what I was saying, we have 2 scenarios. One is a scenario with a portion of the Colorado resource mix being effectively supplanted by SPP wind. This was one of the concepts that was requested, and trying to understand the transmission ramifications of that. John's going to talk about how we approach that from a capacity expansion modeling perspective. And then we're also going to talk about a high demand scenario where we've got forecast for high electrification and large point loads, data center, hydrogen production, so on and so forth, that could materialize in Colorado and the corresponding resource plan. So those are both draft today and are inviting reactions and comments. And then the next portion of the presentation is definitely the bulk. John's going to spend about 20 or 25 minutes on that. Tom Green, who's been leading the transmission assessment from our team, basically taking the portfolio that John's going to present and assessing the transmission needs associated with that. This is effectively a review of the assessment methodology we've been discussing, but more importantly, a presentation of the draft transmission portfolios that we've arrived at and we're soliciting feedback on. So that feedback can come in the form of, hey, did you consider this alternative? And we also have some information about how we're considering different transmission technologies for those. So we're definitely looking for feedback, and we've got some preliminary views on what that portfolio looks like. We are presenting some costs estimates today for those portfolios. I'm just going to say it for the first time and probably 2 or 3 other times. Those are draft and or preliminary. This is we're in the circle of trust here. You're in the process, so we're sharing preliminary information with you. You know, that's not the answer. So please understand that. That's one of the trade-offs that we have with these processes. Is you have to understand we are going to share things with you that are not final yet. So please don't take that information and project it as the final answer, because the cost will change by the time we get to the end of this. The third thing that I'm actually going to take the mic back at the end here and give you an update. I've been slowly going through methodology. Now we're approaching the point where we're going to do a congestion assessment, and I'll talk about why and how we're doing that, what our kind of base production cost model looks like. And then I know the scenarios are confusing because we're kind of using different tools to look at different components. I'm going to try to pull some of that together more and give you some more background on the extreme event scenario. John's pretty much taking care of the demand scenario, but I'm going to emphasize the feedback we'd like to get there. And then I'm going to talk about the regional integration scenarios and the other studies we're thinking about getting. I think we know how to do about 2 of the 3 kind of sub-analyses for that, but there's a third one that we need feedback on. So that's the kind of the agenda, really, and the kind of main technical objectives that we have today. So go to the next slide. And this is just additional background on the study, so we can skip through this. Feel free to come back to these. Go to the next one. And these will, if anybody's going to ask this momentarily, these slides will be posted. We typically try to get them done way ahead of time, and admittedly, we didn't get that this week, so they'll be posted later today. Next slide. Oh, this is a new one. So this is our workflow. And I created a version of this. If you go to the next slide, please, Deborah. This really shows where we're at with the study. So everything that's in green on the left-hand side, we're done with. We've completed those tasks. We have information that's been building up to the analysis that's ongoing now. The work that's underway is primarily this reliability analysis and the development of this production cost model. And the work that's yet to be done is the congestion assessment and the synthesis of all this to kind of finalize a set of, transmission solutions in a transmission portfolio. So this just gives you a good view, I think, on progress made to date and work that remains. Next slide. Okay, so this is the agenda, and it's going to accomplish the things that I mentioned. So the first thing that I did not mention, though, is Kathy's going to walk through just an overview of our stakeholder engagement we've had so far. It's an important part of this project. And then, as I mentioned, John's going to pick up on item number 2. I'm going to come, or Tom's going to take on item number 3. I'll come back in with number 4, and then Kathy, you'll be covering any stakeholder questions or facilitating that. And then we'll end with some next steps, which is really just revisiting some tasks that's going to come out in the course of these materials. So again, thanks, and I'll hand it off to Kathy now.
Thanks, Keegan. Deb, if you could keep going, please. Thank you. Yeah, so the timeline and stakeholder engagement. This should be a familiar slide as well to you. We've had this in the last 2 meetings, and as we sort of clicking through the timeline here, officially, the initial report is due to the PUC by September 1st, and we are in the process of scheduling a meeting with the PUC probably late August, so we will certainly let stakeholders know. Thereafter, we'll do some comment period with stakeholders on the draft results, and then final report is due to the joint energy committees at the General Assembly by the end of January 2025. So leading up to that, as our commitment to stakeholder engagement, we've been providing a 4-meeting series. We are in stakeholder meeting number 3 today, where we're going to review that reference case reliability results and talk through some of the potential solutions. We've held 2 meetings prior to that to introduce the study and talk through scenarios, and then also some additional stakeholder outreach by email. That was the bus bar mapping proposal and feedback there as well. So a third opportunity there that we heard from you all and really appreciate that. And then a fourth stakeholder meeting coming in July. We have yet to set the date. I will also communicate that by email and via the website. And then, of course, the ongoing informal exchange that Keegan talked about. We have really appreciated the feedback, and some of the real detailed information that's come from you all has been very informative and useful for the team to work through as they have done their analysis. Next slide, please. So meeting participation, you all have been doing a great job with this. We really appreciate everyone following these guidelines. Should be very familiar to you. Please mute your mic when you're not talking. Hold your questions. We have breaks throughout the 2-hour meeting this morning where we'll have a chance for stakeholder questions and dialogue. Please do raise your hand if you wish to speak. That helps us to know who's on deck, or use your chat. We can go there as well. Do turn your camera on while you're talking. Please be respectful and do share your ideas, but also leave time for others. And we are recording, as I said, at the top of the hour. So please keep it up. You guys are doing a great job, and that makes for a smooth process for us. Thank you. And then as far as stakeholder comments, so these came in after meeting number 2, and also a handful that came in after the bus bar mapping proposal. So we had asked for feedback on scenario scopes and got lots of good input of how the team should craft the extreme event, what to think about for the high demand and the regional integration. So Keegan will come back to that later in the presentation today to let you know where the team landed on those modeling inputs. Quite a bit of feedback for us on commercial interest. Specifically, several folks referenced the queued up study from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and needing a more current data set. So thank you to the utilities who gave us good information there to update that. And we heard loud and clear from everybody that the amount of wind that was initially proposed for the resource allocation in the western slope was unrealistic. And so the team has reallocated around that, recognized that right off the bat. Then some feedback on the bus bar mapping, very technical stuff. I'll let the modelers address that one, and how to consider the advanced technologies and reconductoring. We'll address that as we get going here. And then finally, the May Valley Longhorn extension, very specific question. Yes, that is included in the 10 and 20-year models. So you see there the team response in summary of how we've incorporated that and how we've really worked that constructive feedback to us into the workflow for the team. Keegan, anything you'd add there on the team response?
No, those are great responses, Kathy. I think the what people will find is most of the comments that we got, I think, are going to be addressed through the course of the materials we're going through today. So I think that's sufficient for now.
Good. Yep. And you see on the bottom of the slide there, the written comments. If you want to see specifically what came in from individuals, it is on the CETA study webpage. So go there if you want more specifics. And then I'll hand it back to the team. Thank you.
Right. Hi, everyone. My name is John Moose. I am going to be taking this second section, looking at the 20-year expansion plan. So really what I want to do today before we get into any material is, explain what I'm going to be going over at a high level. So the first part of my section, I'll be spending the next maybe 10 minutes or so, maybe 15, covering how we went about the capacity expansion plan and the bus bar map, the zonal allocation and the bus bar mapping. So that was meant to inform where resources are placed in the 20-year assessment. So we've already done the 10-year assessment. This is looking in that next decade and identifying what resources on top of what was identified in the 10-year plan are needed in the 20-year plan to kind of keep the state of Colorado on track to its policy goals, as well as we use a model, the Resolve model, which was developed by E3 to ensure that portfolio, can serve energy demand and other things like that. So firm capacity needs. And so that's the kind of what I'll be taking you through. So that's part one. And then the second part is the 2 study scenarios that we've developed that, again, Keegan mentioned, and we will be seeking feedback for one of them. So this slide takes us through the process and kind of has some of my detailed notes on what
Hey,
we've.
Doug, it's Matthew Shapiro. How's it going?
I think.
Sorry, John, little interference. We got it. Go ahead.
No worries. Okay, thank you. So as you know, modeling of this nature is not always linear. We try things, we make findings, we receive feedback, and so the bullets on this slide kind of show what has happened since the last stakeholder meeting. There has been some email stakeholder outreach that you all probably have seen, but this is kind of starting from the last stakeholder meeting when we last took a look at things where we're at. So the main thing is to develop this 10 to 20 year portfolio. We kind of pivoted how we use Resolve in that process. So initially we were, trying and hoping to use Resolve to give us, a build out, and it chooses the right things in the right locations that we could just plug that in. But we found that, there was some limitations both in kind of how things are modeled in Resolve, namely how things are synchronized, how load and renewable shapes are synchronized, as well as a subset of representative days that are used to make the modeling a little bit computationally easier. That made things challenging for us to update in the Resolve model as we had kind of originally expected. And more importantly, we also didn't find a good way to represent the cost of transmission upgrades into the resource choices that were made in the Resolve model. So without that, we didn't feel like that was an adequate kind of set of criteria on which to make these resource decisions in this 10 to 20 year time frame. So based on that's kind of what we presented in stakeholder meeting 2. And based on feedback, we've kind of scaled back the use of Resolve. Where we use it, we know that it's good to determine, that we have enough energy supply, that we can, have ELCC, like a firm capacity contribution for the resources we're adding. But we're really just then taking the statewide build out and performing a more in-depth allocation of those resources out into the state that in a way that makes a lot more sense. I think is a lot more intuitive. So that's really, if you want to go back to the April 12th stakeholder outreach, that's where some of that material will be covered in depth. I'm not going to cover all of that today. I'll cover it more at a high level. And I just want to note that we have been making updates to this process based on stakeholder feedback throughout this process. So since April 12th, we have been making stakeholder feedback. So let's go ahead and get into it. So this is my view of how the capacity expansion modeling feeds into the 20-year study. So we're using Resolve to develop a statewide portfolio that's the 2035 to 45 incremental resource additions. We're allocating those out to zones in the state of Colorado, and then within each zone we are identifying buses within that area to map to, and then we've made modifications on stakeholder feedback. The locations and the sizes of those generators are what get fed into the 20-year transmission study that Tom will be talking about. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, these resources are on top of existing planned and conceptual like IRP portfolios out into the future. So that this image on the right kind of shows how everything but the yellow shows kind of how we see the Colorado generation fleet evolving over the next 20 years. And the yellow bars are basically what we're identifying on top of that is kind of necessary for Colorado to stay on track. So stay on track in terms of their policy goals as well as system planning needs. And I've outlined what that portfolio is consists of. So it's about 7 gigawatts of wind, 2.9 gigawatts of solar PV, 3 gigawatts of new firm, and then almost 2 gigawatts of 4-hour battery storage. Now, this is, again, just one kind of deterministic outlook at the future. This is from Resolve, this is the least cost. But there's, obviously a wide range of potential futures that, could potentially come to fruition. So this is just one that we're representing in our base case. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we allocate that resource capacity into one of 9 study zones. And we kind of took a slightly different approach for wind and solar than we did for the new firm and the battery resources. I'll just say from a high level, adding significant amounts of resources onto a grid that has, present day kind of limited hosting capacity can be more of an art than a science. But we tried to make it as informed as possible in terms of what first, the first step we took here is really our attempt at what do we know about the grid and its hosting capacity in kind of the near term. Again, that's based on our 10-year representation. So from the 10-year looking forward, is there any areas where we can, include wind or solar resources in the system that are going to have a minimal impact to transmission upgrades? So that was really our first step. And then secondly, beyond that, we kind of had to fall back on other, considerations. And so that's development potential, resource quality, and a qualitative review of commercial interest. As I mentioned, we're not certain of exactly how things are going to come to fruition or how this portfolio would come to fruition. So we are testing some low and high resource levels where we're adjusting these wind and solar resources by plus and minus 30%. So that's kind of our attempt at representing that uncertainty. And then in terms of the new firm and the battery storage resources, so we really tried to, especially for the new firm, find areas where transmission would be freeing up from retiring coal facilities. Again, we assume coal retirement's consistent with IRP plans and S&P Global and a number of kind of public data sources. So identifying areas in the grid that might be able to kind of host any new firm capacity. And then for battery storage, we kind of co-located it with solar, and then also in metro areas and other areas, just kind of based on our assessment of how useful it could be at mitigating new transmission builds if possible. So those are kind of the criteria that went into that. The table on the right there shows the resource allocations into our 9 zones. And then if you go to the next slide, it's the same material, but it's just shown in a map. So this map kind of shows how resources got allocated to different zones in the model. And you'll notice that we made a Denver metro zone that we specifically added battery storage to. This was based on stakeholder feedback, and I think makes a lot more sense. Previously, we didn't have metro as its own zone, and so we had battery storage kind of spread out across zones that were meant to represent the metro area. Next slide, please. So once we had those zonal allocations, the next step was to map things to bus bars within those zones. And so Tom will be kind of covering a good portion of this, but the way that went down is that we worked with a subcontractor, Emily Leslie at Montara Mountain Energy, and she did an analysis where she helped us rank order bus bars based on a number of different criteria. And so commercial interest, voltage, and other criteria. And so we basically, for each of our 9 zones in the model, we kind of rank ordered the buses based on those criteria, and then basically kind of had this iterative process where we would allocate up to a certain amount of capacity at each of those buses. And then that was kind of a preliminary, just first pass, kind of an automated process. And then we passed that along to Tom and others, and per stakeholder feedback, Tom made a number of changes, again based on his experience and stakeholder feedback. And so that was all part of the process. We wanted a human in the loop for that decision-making process. So next slide, please. So this shows where exactly things get mapped out in each study zone. And so this is, there's a map and a table here. Tom will also cover this, but I just want to kind of preliminarily show this and say this is where all of our work led into. So this is really what Tom kind of took into his modeling for the 20-year transmission study. And he will talk about this a little bit more in his section. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide and the study sensitivities, and then we should have time to take a couple questions on this. So we're kind of going back now and starting the process over again, looking at, okay, we're developing capacity expansion portfolios for 2 additional sensitivities. From my understanding, these sensitivities were developed kind of based on stakeholder feedback and other discussions. And so the 2 that I'll be discussing are kind of categorized as the planning scenarios. And those are the regional integration, representing kind of Colorado's integration with a broader SPP market. And then the second is a high demand future that I'll talk about as well. So let's go ahead and get into the first one. All right, so this one basically, the purpose of this study is to understand how and where transmission needs change under a future with kind of alternative regional integration outcomes. So this is one of a couple sub-analyses that we're doing in an attempt to answer a broad range of stakeholder questions. And this really looks at what happens if Colorado looks to SPP for some of its resource supply, or especially wind, because there's high quality wind in the SPP region. And so what we did was the capacity expansion piece of this is pretty simple. We assumed that Colorado would procure 2 gigawatts of SPP wind resources in 2035. That was kind of meant to be a reasonable, a reasonable level of sharing with SPP, but it's not it was not developed based on an optimization. So we kind of just feed that in, and then we let the model build around that. And like I said, for the capacity expansion piece, this is pretty simple, but it'll have broader ramifications when we do the transmission analysis, namely trying how we reflect how this resource or set of resources might be transmitted to Colorado would have implications on kind of the transmission study. So we did some benchmarking. The wind that we put in there for SPP, we added a kind of a altered new shape that represents its capacity factor of about 45, and we did that by sampling historical capacity factors for a number of wind shapes near Colorado in the SPP market, so kind of on the western side of SPP. like I said, the model determines additional resources on top of that. And the portfolio really, as you can see within the bar chart here, it looks really similar to the reference case. It does have a slight reduction in Colorado wind built, and I think that makes sense. And that's over 2,000, and that's likely because the capacity factor of the wind that we added for SPP is slightly higher than that of what we had in Colorado. So that's the regional integration, and then let's move on to the high demand scenario. So the purpose of this scenario is to understand kind of how and where transmission needs change under a future with high load growth and electrification. So we did benchmarking of loads with the NREL electrification futures scenario. So our reference case was based on the medium moderate electrification future. And this high demand was based on the high moderate electrification future. And so that just represents basically a deep electrification future for load. So notably, this actually, the resolve model that we procured for this study was used in 2021 for a greenhouse gas roadmap study. And the high demand, kind of the demand modeled in this scenario was similar in scale to the highest load. I forget exactly what the scenario is called, the House Bill 1261 or something like that. It was similar in magnitude to that scenario. And there's some documentation on that I think might be helpful if you want to understand what assumptions go into load growth of this nature. But really what we're seeing is that peak load, this is load served by Colorado generators, reaches about 20 gigawatts by 2045 relative to 13.8 in the reference case. So we're looking at roughly a 6 gigawatt increase in peak load relative to our reference case in this. We also, so as I mentioned, we used the NREL EFS high and moderate electrification future, but we also looked at the Excel ERP and used that to inform the growth as well. And we saw some information in there about how there were some new large point loads like data centers and hydrogen production. So that was kind of another piece of the basis that we use to benchmark this load growth going forward. So what we see if you look down in the bottom right-hand side is that there's the new firm and the wind are roughly the same as the reference case, and the model is selecting 15 gigawatts of solar capacity and 10 gigawatts of additional batteries to serve this load. That is obviously a pretty large increase in generation, nameplate generation capacity. This case, we did fix the new firm resource to be the same capacity as in the reference case, basically just to see what it would be if we used, solar and or wind to get to this higher load growth future. That is something that we have tested the counterfactual of as well. So that is something that we're seeking stakeholder feedback on. We could use a future where we allow the new firm resource to build. And so when we tested that, when we relaxed the constraint of you must keep the new firm exactly the same, we saw that there was about 10 gigawatts of new firm resources, and wind and solar are reduced pretty significantly as well. So that is something that I think we would like feedback on. And then we're going to, again, both of these two scenarios are going to there's going to be some reliability and deliverability analysis, and kind of they're going to be compared to the reference case. So I'm not sure I have that much time, but I'm happy to take any questions on anything, and I know that was a lot, so.
Sure, we can open it up for a few minutes here if folks have clarifying questions or want to take a look at some of the charts. Scott?
Thanks, John. On this last scenario, what was the reason that Resolve didn't select any more wind? Did it run out of wind to select, or was it just cost?
No, so it had more wind available. So the way that Resolve worked is we had zone specific candidates. And what seems to have happened is, so there's there's in most zones, that the max amount that you can build in a zone is not constrained. But for the wind in this, it did kind of hit a zonal limit. And then the next kind of cheapest resource that it had was this solar and storage. And so it got constrained in one zone, and then it went to the next cheapest resource, which was solar and battery. But there were other wind resources available, but for whatever reason, those did not get chosen. So overall, no, there was more wind capacity that the model could have selected.
Thank you, Scott. Dan, we'll go to you next, and then Ken Wiscosa.
Hi, I know there's so many moving pieces, so many different things that you could look at. It just strikes me that a lot of the load that is likely to be added or that will be added during the term of the study will be controllable load. And so I'm wondering to what, whether you considered looking at, demand reduction, demand response, virtual power plant kind of approaches to reduce the peak that you need to serve. And or if there's room to add that into the study at this point. You're muted, John.
Oh, whoops. Yeah, that's a really great question. So the loads that we added, as I mentioned, we kind of did a kind of a comparison between the load growth that we were forecasting for this kind of future based on NREL EFS and the Excel ERP point loads and things like that. We benchmarked that with again, I'm blanking on the name. I think it's House Bill 1261 scenario that was modeled in Resolve. And that scenario had it has different load components in it. They are fixed, so it's like it has a profile for them, but it has things like heavy duty vehicle, light duty vehicle. There's a baseline load. I can't remember all the different categories there, but the proportions of those, how much of your load is a heavy duty vehicle load versus a baseline or residential load, is different in this scenario than it is in our reference. So there is some of that representation in the load profiles themselves. And that's something that you could take a look at and probably critique. We did model those proportions consistent with that House Bill 1261. And in fact, ours were basically the House Bill 1261 load profiles just scaled down slightly. Ours actually were not quite as high, but they do have kind of those differing components that would shift the peak and the shape of the loads. In terms of,
I guess what I'm asking about, just to clarify, it sounds like you're talking about different components of the load and how that affects their contribution toward peak. I guess my question is more about, the ability to have demand responsiveness that can reduce the peak at specific times.
Yep, I'm pretty sure that there was some of that represented in the model. I would have to go back and double check. But if so, yeah, I don't remember I don't know exactly how much there was. So I could get back to you on that if you would like. But
I just want to suggest that would be a very interesting, I certainly would be interested, and I think probably a lot of parties would be interested in looking at a scenario where you have a pretty significant penetration or pretty significant ability to shift load. I mean, let's say a lot of the demand that's added is data centers. Data centers can shift their load all over the country very quickly, it's my understanding. depending on what's going on with the grid. So that's a potential there too, is in addition to vehicles and probably to a much lesser degree, heat pump loads.
Thanks, Dan. That sounds like one that we'll maybe take back and get some answers for you. We'll follow up. And I'm going to move on to Ken then, and we'll take Ken as our last question and then move on to the next part of the presentation.
So I noted in your regional integration scenario that you were showing about 2 gigawatts of import from SPP of wind. It occurs to me that if we have the capability of importing and exporting 2 gigawatts, we would probably be exporting like 2 gigawatts of solar into SPP. Have you thought about including that in the model, because it might also help to economize solar in the state as well? Anyway, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so that's definitely, I will just say that concept is not represented in this capacity expansion modeling. And I would probably defer to Keegan or Tom as to what future, subsequent studies will be doing as part of this, or analyses will be doing as part of this, and if they are capable of accounting for that. So I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not the
I could.
person to.
So Ken, I think the thing to think about there is, really it's how many games of three-dimensional chess do we want to play at the same time? So your point is probably true. Colorado could become a solar exporter. To what extent does that impact the transmission system is kind of all that I really care about in the context of this study. And so I maybe encourage you to think through that a little bit and send us some comments. If there is a discrete impact that you would say that's relevant to the study, where we can definitely take that into account. But sort of if it gets exported and it's developed close to where it's exported from, the impact on the Colorado transmission system is maybe intuitively, null or very little. So just think through that. I think it's interesting from a market perspective, meaning just additional development activity. But again, just trying to recenter us. What's the transmission impact on Colorado?
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Okay, if we want to move on to the next slide, please, Deb. And we're on to the 20-year reliability assessments.
Sorry, just to reiterate one thing, Kathy, if you can go back, just want to, we really do want some feedback from stakeholders on this point that John asked about. He did emphasize it, and I'm just going to re-emphasize it. This variability on how much new, clean, firm power is built, that's a pretty significant variable. And we don't know that there's an exact right answer. A lot of that's subject to kind of technological innovation that we can't forecast out for 20 years. And so really would appreciate perspectives on that. So, all right. Thanks, Kathy.
And I think we're on to Tom.
All right. Just want to make sure you can hear me.
Sounds good. Yep. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks. Good morning. Now we're going to get into what I think is the best part of the presentation. This is really exciting. So this slide here really kind of zooms in on the flow process that Keegan showed earlier, really a simplified version of what we're doing with the reliability modeling. And we talked about this in the previous stakeholder meeting about all the things we did for the 10-year, and we're going beyond that to the 20-year. But the process is very similar in that we do our reliability assessment. We try to uncover issues associated with those assessments, make some preliminary recommendations, and then again, we'll be asking for feedback from all of you in regards to what our results are. And so just to set the stage a little bit, our goal here is to understand the transmission capacity needed. And we've indicated this before. And even though later in the presentation, you'll see some an actual portfolio that we've developed based on the results. The idea behind this is to try to understand the magnitude of transmission development that might be needed. And these are based on the assumptions that we used. And so again, well, I'll talk a little bit more about the assumptions that went into this analysis. And John really set the stage for the resource assumptions and where we located those. And of course, you know, every study is dependent on the assumptions, but the resource assumptions John really laid out as to, you know, where we located those resources, the magnitude of those resources, and that really helped develop the basis for the studies going into this. So if you move on to the next slide, just to talk a little bit more about the methodology. You know, we did talk about this when we did the methodology for the 10-year assessment. And this is a very similar slide to what we showed for the 10-year assessment. But in this case, we're doing things a little bit, I don't want to say backwards, but in a, you know, a different process. So during that, you know, discussion about the methodology for the 10-year assessment, we looked at it in terms of what we call reliability versus deliverability. Now, as a planner, everything we look at is in terms of reliability. But back then, we took a, you know, a 10-year case, a 10-year model, and we added, you know, some additional generation to that case, made some assumptions about that, and did kind of a statewide assessment of that 10-year case. And then we moved on to what we called the deliverability aspect. And that's where we really broke down zone by zone within the state, tried to stress the transmission system for each of those zones to really get an understanding of where the weaknesses are and where transmission might be needed. We did that with the 10-year. And so for the 20-year, we're doing a little bit of a different approach where we're starting with the deliverability side. And in this instance, we're doing the zone by zone approach, trying to determine what the transmission issues are, where we see the needs, developing a transmission portfolio or overlay based on that zonal analysis. And then subsequent to that, we'll be taking all that information, putting that into a single model and doing then what we call the overall statewide reliability assessment. So a little bit different for the 20-year analysis. If you go on to the next slide, I'll get a little bit more in detail about the methodology. And so for any of our studies, you know, there are some essential components that go into the assumptions that we make before we initiate the studies. And that really has to do with what load are we going to model, what it's the generation that we're going to model, and what's the transmission that we're going to put in there, at least for the benchmark models before we start to do the evaluation. So as far as the load goes, John touched on this a little bit, but you know, between the 10-year time frame and a 20-year time frame, the load is going to grow. We have to make some assumptions around what that load growth will be. And so we got this information, you know, from a variety of sources, but starting with the 10-year case, we assumed a compound annual growth rate of around 1.9%. And what that really means, so around 2%, you can look at a lot of different load growth factors. We did look at, you know, the different utilities, resource plans and what they're thinking about. And so this is where we landed. And what that really means practically is it is about 120% more load in the 20-year case than what we had in the 10-year case. So in terms of megawatts, that's like a 3,000 megawatt increase in Colorado load just on its own. So the 3 gigawatt load increase. The generation we've already talked about. John has gone through that. I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail, where we took that 10-year case, and then as we started developing our models for the 20-year case, we included that generation that was included in those resolved models, and we put that in specific locations. As John mentioned,
Tom,
you know,
Tom, I think it's actually just 20.4% higher.
Sorry.
Yeah, not 120.
I think our megawatts are right though.
Yeah.
So 20% higher from that benchmark model. So as you know, we mentioned, we started out with the resolve. We had, you know, recommendations for wind and solar. We provided that information to stakeholders, and then in the meantime, we got feedback back from them, and then we also added both gas and battery storage in addition to the wind and solar. As far as the transmission goes, we used the same transmission that we had already established in the 10-year models, and we used that for our benchmark going into the 20-year assessments, and then built on top of that. The next slide is just some additional methodology in terms of how we performed our assessment. John mentioned the zones. You think back to the second stakeholder meeting when we did our 10-year analysis, we just broke the state of Colorado into 4 zones for doing that analysis. Based on the bus bar mapping, we expanded that even further. And so now with this 20-year analysis, we have 9 zones where we're looking at stressing the system from each of those zones. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. As far as our methodology, similar to the 10-year, we evaluated each zone independently. What we did is we dispatched the resources in each of those zones, both the existing and the new generation, to maximum or near maximum levels, and then scheduled that out of the zone to other zones within the state, or if necessary, outside the state. And that's just a common practice that planners use to stress the system in each of those areas to get an idea of where the weaknesses are and uncover the hot spots that may need to be addressed. So this is very similar to what a lot of utilities do. If you are familiar with large generator interconnection studies, there's a cluster process where entities will break their systems down into smaller pockets or clusters and do similar type of analysis. So it's a common method of doing the analysis. Our performance measuring was similar to the 10-year. I will say that as you get to the 20-year time frame, you have a lot more issues associated just with getting cases to converge or really come around a solution just because of the magnitude of the load and generation. So we really focus more on loading and solution issues versus sometimes planners look at voltages. And those are issues that you can usually handle with other methods. So all that to say is it was pretty consistent with how we did our 10-year analysis. If you go on to the next slide, I see another error in here in that our total is closer to the 15 gigawatt level versus the 13.8 that it's shown here. But what's described here are the zones that we used. And so John mentioned, we established a Denver metro zone in part to put some battery storage there, but it was also to help us on our planning aspect. That Denver metro zone was not meant to try to understand all the transmission limitations inside the Denver metro, because as we've stated before, our goal is not to understand all of those issues, but to really understand what kind of transmission may be necessary to deliver power to that metro zone. So we use that on the planning side more as a sink. So as we raise up the generation in each of these zones outside of the metro, we'll schedule that to the metro area and also to areas beyond to help us with our study. We did adjust our southern Colorado zone a little bit to incorporate kind of that whole Front Range corridor leading up to the metro. So that now encompasses not just the Pueblo area, but really the Colorado Springs area as well. In some of the previous pictures you've seen, that Colorado Springs area was included more in some of those eastern zones, and it just made more sense to us to include that in that south central zone as we did our analysis. Another thing I wanted to point out that you may notice that's a little bit different is we had some naming conventions with some of the prior stakeholder meetings where we called these zones. For example, the Northwest was the Rifle Zone, Southwest was the Montrose Zone. For simplification, you'll see that we kind of shifted just to more geographic type descriptions of the zones in Colorado. So Northwest, Southwest, Northeast, South Central. So that kind of a naming convention. And so this slide, again, it gives a summary of the resources that were added, at least capacity wise, for each of these zones. You see the bubbles, the colors meant to show, blue is the wind, the yellow is the solar, the orange is the gas, and the green is the battery storage capability that we put inside each of those zones. And that gives you, an overall quantity if you look at the totals on the right of that table. So not all of the zones were, equal in terms of what we added based on the resolve modeling. If you go on down to the next slide, and again, John touched on this, but this really gets more granular in terms of where exactly we put the resources. And so as you see for each of those zones listed on the left side of that table, those are the substations where we located the resources in terms of wind, solar, gas, and battery. And so a lot of this was familiar from what you saw through the PowerPoint that we presented on April the 12th regarding the bus bar mapping. We did make some adjustments based on stakeholder feedback from that bus bar mapping presentation. We got some good feedback from stakeholders, and in particular, Piesco has some experience with generation location in those areas. So a couple of examples, I think originally we had some generation down east of Pueblo around Boone. That didn't make a lot of sense. So we moved that farther out to the east around May Valley. We had some generation, I think, on the Cheyenne Gentai around Pronghorn. We ended up shifting that farther out towards the Goose Creek area on the Colorado Power Pathway. So just a couple of examples of some adjustments that we made to the generator mapping. The map there on the right is really meant to show just kind of, again, with that same color scheme and the size of the bubbles, the level of generation that we added for each of those zones. So that's kind of getting grounded in where we placed the resources in our 20-year models. So I think the next slide, we actually get into some of the results. And so again, we call these draft. These are the studies we did, the issues that we uncovered, and this will lead up to the portfolio that I'll show here in the next couple of slides. But starting with, rather than go through zone by zone, I would just kind of lump these into, I think I've got 3 slides here, showing some combinations of the zones and some of the issues that we uncovered. And again, when I talk about issues in a 20-year situation, when we start to do an assessment, for planners realize this, but the models really have a hard time coming to a good solution where you have some good results when you have these types of levels of generation and loads in the system with a lack of transmission. So when I talk about issues, you'll see this, and try not to use too much jargon, but these are unsolved contingencies. So where we do contingency analysis, where we take the system, we take elements out of service, we look at the performance of the system, and primarily look at element loading. Are we seeing transmission lines or transformers that are loaded beyond their normal capacity, or do we see voltages that are starting to deviate beyond what would normally be acceptable? In this case, we're really trying to hone in on these unsolved contingencies where we've taken outages and the system really just blows up. And so what I've tried to highlight here are areas of the system where we've just seen these blow-ups, where we need to add transmission to get the case to solve and to get back into a stable position. So this first slide is showing what I call the north central, the northeast, and the eastern parts of the state. Those are 3 of the zones that we focused on in this slide. And so on the red circles there, that's describing the issues that we saw for the north central zone. The orange are the issues that we saw for the northeast zone, and then the green there for the eastern part of the zone. So you can kind of see there the north central part as you start to take the generation and in that zone, raise it up to maximum, schedule it outside of the zone, you start to see these types of issues. And I was fairly general about these issues, but around you know, the St. Verian area, Fort Lupton, Rocky Mountain Energy Center. Those are areas where we're just really seeing a lot of issues because of that high generation getting scheduled through that zone. I will note that the St. Vrain tried to highlight areas that we also saw in the 10-year cases. So St. Vrain was one of those areas that we also saw in the 10-year case when we were increasing generation and trying to get that to flow outside of the area. So for each of these blocks, you can kind of see I listed the issues, and again, the issues are in terms of, you know, where we saw issues with the contingency, where the case really had problems, and the transmission solutions that we plugged in to the model to alleviate those issues. So for example, that first one in North Central, we added an alt to Kyoto 345 kV line. We had to add another alt to Husky line, and that was primarily due to we added, I think, about 750 megawatts of generation at Husky. So we needed a new line there. You know, in hindsight, maybe that wasn't the best spot, but that's where the resolve model showed. So that's how we started with that. Just a little tie, but again, that's, you know, some of the issues that we uncovered through there. The last one there is a Fort Lupton Pawnee 230 kV line. So for each of these zones, we had a similar process. So you can see the Northeast was very similar. You see the kind of the hot spots there on the east. Again, not surprising, you know, as you move out towards the east, a more lower voltage transmission, a lot of 115, 230 versus the 345. So you start to see some of those systems are really having a hard time accommodating the resources that we put into the system. And then on the east side, you know, similar, there's a lot of areas out east that are 115, 230. And so there's, that's just meant to show some of the hot spots there and some of the solutions that we started to add in to the model. If you move on to the next slide, it's just a similar analysis, but in this case, we lumped in the Southeast, the South Central, and I also included the San Luis Valley in this analysis. And I know this map is kind of hard to read, but really this is the southeast quadrant of the state of Colorado. So just to ground yourself, up in the top center of that is the Denver metro area. So that first yellow circle is really the Colorado Springs area. But starting with the southeast, you know, we had some issues around the Lamar area that we were starting to see as we cranked up the generation. Remember, I tried to put some little tables in here to get you grounded on the type of new resources that we added. And so we added 2,000 megawatts, all at May Valley, which is Lamar, Colorado, for those familiar with that. And so, of course, as we started to do this analysis, we saw issues around that area. The South Central, what we started to see here, and again, this is not a surprising situation because we saw this in the 10-year case as well. And I think this is actually in a somewhat of an existing condition. That system through the Colorado Springs area, you know, it's a lower voltage system in parallel with a higher voltage system. And as power gets transferred up from that Pueblo area, however it gets there from Lamar or Pueblo itself, you know, we start to see issues in that corridor, that Front Range corridor through the Colorado Springs area. So we have a few transmission solutions that we added in that area. Finally, San Luis Valley, no surprise, it's a problem today. It was a problem in the 10-year case. It's a problem in the 20-year case. You know, there's you lose any of the lines in that area, it causes some problems. So we have some recommendations for that area as well. Just to start to key up, what you might notice in this southeast quadrant is that you don't see as many transmission solutions in this area. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The last slide, I've lumped into just the west. So you have the northwest and the southwest. And in this area, for the amount of resources that we added, combined with the significant retirements, primarily at Craig and Hayden, we didn't have the convergence or non-solution issues that we did with the other zones. We did see some overloads on the system when we added. And so that's where this slide is a little bit different. And then I show the overloads in orange. And so those are the orange circles there. And there's some overlap there with the red circles. But, these are, areas of the western slope that there's a lot of 115, 230 kV areas that are a little bit weak. And when you add resources over there, you start to see pieces of that overload. So we really didn't see big drivers for transmission on the western slope. What we did is, since we weren't seeing a lot of issues with the levels of generation that we had based on the resolve models, is that we took those levels and actually increased the generation beyond what we had in resolve. So in the Northwest, we started cranking up around 500, and then we started to see issues when we went beyond 500 megawatts up in that northwest zone. The southwest zone, it took us around 1,000 to 1,500 megawatts of additional resources before we really started to see issues. So that was an exercise we went through here just to try to understand, okay, if there aren't issues associated with the resources that we modeled using those resolve models, what kind of levels would drive that? And so that was good information for us to really understand, what those levels might be. And so that's the red circles there, and kind of gives an indication of, on the Northwest, once you go about 500 beyond that, we started to see issues. Southwest, 1,000 to 1,500, we started to see some issues there. Okay, next slide. All right, here's kind of the punchline, or the overall results based on those 3 slides prior to this and what I talked through for each of the zones. The transmission solutions that were listed for each of those zonal studies are presented here on this map as a draft portfolio. So again, this is not the plan. This is a plan that mitigated the issues that we found based on the assumptions, and it gives an overall level of magnitude of transmission build out that you might need for those assumptions in the 20-year time frame. So as Keegan mentioned earlier, you're going to start to see some preliminary cost numbers in here as well. So for this portfolio, we did generate some cost estimates. And as you see, the costs there are around $4 billion based on this portfolio. Now, a couple of things I'll point out about this map right here. First of all, the solid lines are part of the portfolio that alleviated the performance issues that we uncovered. The red lines are 345, the blue lines are 230. The dashed lines are what we call alternative or conceptual type projects that either could be utilized as resources are increased, or alternative projects that could be used in lieu of some of the solid lines that are on there. So like I mentioned on the western slope, we did crank up the generation until we did find issues, and then we developed a solution for that, which is that dashed red line along the western slope, really from Craig all the way down to the Lost Canyon area. And the other dashed line over there is from the Montrose in to the Poncha area. So just to kind of go through that again, on the north side, we developed some 345, and the northeast side, a little bit of 345 between like the Kyoto, which is a 345 kV substation on the Laramie River to Pawnee line, jumpered that over to around Alt. And then we have some potential lines then from Alt down into the St. Vrain area. You see some solid blue 230 kV lines in the northeast area, really from that Ray, North Yuma, all the way up to Spring Canyon and on into Wyoming, the Sydney Steagle area that we saw helped mitigate the problems we saw up there. And then another that horizontal line there across from North Yuma all the way into Pawnee and then on into the Denver area. Moving on down, we saw an additional transmission need basically between Harvest Mile and Missile Site, and then on down to Pronghorn. Some of that is just due to the, the radial nature of that tie down in there. You see a couple other takeaways that I wanted to point out. I'll just move to the south first. San Luis Valley, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. We ran 2 double circuit 230 kV lines from the valley up into Poncha, and then 345 from Poncha into Midway. That's very similar to what the CCPG and Tri-State and Piesco have been evaluating, coming up with solutions very similar to that. This is maybe a little bit beefier because we're looking at a 20-year time frame. And then you notice a solid blue line basically between Pueblo and New Mexico. And I think that's Tri-State could attest to this, and others, there's kind of a known weak system between Pueblo and New Mexico. And that's not even, that was seen in the 10-year case. I think that's even a problem today. We just went ahead and fixed that by putting a 230 kV line there. Another takeaway that I'll mention here, that we saw advantage to tying in the Colorado Power Pathway to the existing system at around Burlington area and around the Lamar area. So there are a couple of little ties there that they don't just necessarily jump out at you, but we tied in the Goose Creek, which is part of the pathway, to Burlington. And we also tied in May Valley to Lamar. And we found advantages to that. When we ran the analysis without those ties, we ended up with a lot of those dashed lines that you see around the southeast part of the state actually being needed. And so when we included those jumpers into the existing system, we found that those weren't necessarily needed. And so we're showing those as either alternatives or means for expansion. So getting back to the cost aspects, I mentioned that 3.8, close to $4 billion for the solid lines shown on here. But what that includes is just the solid lines themselves are around 2.3 billion. But in addition to that, not only do we have this, but we also had to do some reconductoring to the existing lines to make sure that everything was stable and performed well. So there was another $1.5 billion just of doing some of that reconductoring. That included also adding some new transformers. We tried not to focus too much on transformers because in those instances, we were just like either adding another transformer or beefing up existing transformers that were already there. But all of that additional infrastructure improvement is part of this overall $3.8 billion cost. The other caveat that I guess I'll mention now is we did do some work on the Denver metro area itself, but not a lot. So I don't believe that 1.5 really covers improvements that may be needed in the metro area. And we mentioned this before. I think, Public Service is leading a stakeholder group trying to evaluate what's needed in that metro area, at least for the next ERP and maybe beyond. So this was kind of the punchline. Again, this is the plan that we developed based on the assumptions that we used. We're looking for feedback for this plan to get an idea on alternatives, not only in terms of the transmission, but in terms of the technologies that might be utilized. I do have a slide here in a couple of minutes to describe things that we've thought about already, but maybe go ahead and the next 2 or 3 slides really just go into more detail on what's in that portfolio that was shown on the map. So I've got 2 slides that really describe those solid lines that are on that map. These are high-level descriptions, just overall what the project is, what the voltage is, rough estimate of mileage, and using our cost estimate tool. And I'll just say we have been using MISO cost estimates. There are a lot of ways to get estimates these days, but we just picked that. It seemed similar to more of the Colorado region than some of the other like California type costs, but those are the numbers we use. So just kind of take that as these are relative numbers. And again, they'll change based on stakeholder feedback and as we hone in on the study. The next slide, again, is just a compilation of those solid line projects. And then I've got I think the next to the last row there is showing that 1.5 billion for reconductoring existing lines, adding some transformers, those kinds of things. So these two tables just show how we arrived at that $3.8 billion. The next slide is a summary of those, what I call the alternative and sensitivity type projects. Those are all the projects that we showed in the dashes on that map. And so again, there's 4.6 billion there, but that's not to say that you would need all of those. That's just a compilation of each of those. And so if you go on to the next slide, I think here's where we tried to start brainstorming on, we have that portfolio that we showed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those lines have to be greenfield, new construction projects. And so along there for the alternatives, I started to kind of lay out, as you look back at the map, you can see that a lot of those lines are in corridors where there's already existing transmission. So I think there's opportunity there anywhere that there are existing corridors to rebuild existing lines to lines that are, multi-circuit, higher capacity type transmission. So anywhere where there's existing corridors, I think there's opportunities for that. So those are some of the alternatives that we've started to brainstorm there on how we might accomplish those rather than having to build new. Now, as a planner, we know that's not always possible because some of those lines are utilized to the extent that you can't take them out of service to rebuild them, but at least you can start thinking along those lines. On the right side, we started to thinking about expansion potential. And so, we've heard from stakeholders, well, this is great for Colorado, but what about interstate planning for other transmission? And we intend to do a little bit of that to kind of look at, what this potential build, how it might accommodate some interstate type build. So for example, in the West, if you ran a 345 kV backbone along from Craig all the way to Lost Canyon, that could enable, since we didn't have the resources, but if you did have a tie up to the Gateway line or, outside into Utah or Wyoming, and we're able to get resources imported from that, that might be a driver. So that, potential 345 system that we showed there as an alternative or an expansion plan would help accommodate that. That's an example of that. On the east side, there's some other areas there, the southeast as well. I think that what we have laid out here could accommodate additional transmission from southern Colorado into New Mexico. And on the east side as well, if they're building along that side could also help that out. And then, up to the north, as you start to expand around that Kyoto, that 345, the alt area, that would also, enable additional transmission to come in from Wyoming and, be able to accommodate that as well. We didn't look at that, but we're hoping to at least start to explore some of those kind of alternatives looking outside of the state. I think the next couple of slides are where we kind of key up solutions and methodologies. And as we've indicated, this is where now that we have a portfolio laid out, kind of understand what those issues are, here's where we would like some additional feedback in terms of the solutions that are laid out. How could we, accommodate reconductors, rebuilds that I've mentioned? We might be able to do existing corridors. What might have to be a greenfield? Where might we be able to use advanced conductors when we do those rebuilds, or on some of those reconductors that I listed in that 1.5 billion of upgrades? There's going to be a lot of areas in the state where it's a lot more expensive to tear down towers to put on bigger conductors versus just including some of these advanced conductors on existing structures where you can. The next slide just goes into that in some more detail. And I don't know if Keegan wanted to hit any of these, but these are just kind of the list of solutions and methodologies to evaluate. I guess lastly, before I take questions, just wanted to touch on our next steps. And if you go on to the next slide. Again, as I mentioned, for this 20-year analysis, we started with deliverability. And so now that we have this portfolio, we have taken that portfolio and then have put it back into what I just call a 20-year base reference type model, where we'll put all of that generation or all the transmission into that model. You know, we can back down all the resources to reasonable levels. And for the planners out there, so this would be similar to what you would do with a WEC base case, where you have the planned transmission. You adjust the resources accordingly to match the loads, and we can do an overall reliability assessment of that. And so that'll be the next step for us. We may uncover some issues during that reliability assessment that we didn't do in the deliverability phase. We don't expect to, because that's generally a less stressed condition, but there can be issues that are uncovered that might lead us to tweaking some of our recommendations. Again, one of the main purposes of this was not just to present our findings, but to collect stakeholder feedback. So really realize that this is a lot of information to provide in a short amount of time, but please take this back, kind of take a look at that, see if that makes sense, provide us information on, you know, what you might see as alternatives to what we proposed, how alternative technologies might fit into that. And then as we take that, you know, we can do an assessment on, you know, those viable type alternatives and see how that might adjust our final recommendations. Again, once we have this information, we're planning on moving into the production cost model, which Keegan will talk a little bit more about, how we're taking the reliability piece of it, moving it into the production cost model, where you can do a congestion analysis of the entire system as well, which gives another idea of performance, but also some of the economics. And I think that might be my last slide. So
Thank
a lot
you,
of
Tom.
information.
Yes.
Be happy to try to take some questions.
Lots of questions coming in. Thank you, Tom. Deb, if I could ask you to go back to slide 17, the zonal resource allocations, and why don't we start there? I'm going to start with the chat. Dan, I see some hands coming up, but let's address some of the questions that have already come in. So for the modeling team, we had quite a bit of the generation assumptions in the different zones. So pulling from the chat, the first is whether wind and solar can share some of the transmission, balancing out some of the intermittency and transmission into SPP, where the wind coming in, solar going out from Colorado. Thoughts on wind and solar sharing the transmission system, since they don't usually peak at the same time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, wind and solar can share. It's the, you know, they don't necessarily color the electrons, so that can be shared. We looked more holistically at what the capability would be, you know, ramping up during those stressed conditions. So there may be situations where you can find efficiencies for that, but yeah, of course they can share.
And then as far as some of the resource types, a question about pumped hydro storage in the Craig Hayden area, rather than the 1250 of gas.
Again, it's another type of resource. I've heard of potential for having pumped storage there. Yeah, I mean, if you took, you know, one flavor of resource away, put another flavor there, we're really just getting an idea of what the order of magnitude and the build out might be. But yeah, sure, that it's just another type of resource. We didn't specifically model that, but it's it's an alternative resource that could be implemented in that area.
So we should assume where we see gas, and in some cases new firm, could be pumped hydro, could be with a couple other questions of geothermal potentially. So it's kind of a clean, firm, dispatchable, potentially gas.
Yeah, you know, nothing's going to be as firm as gas. You know, pumped hydro, you still have cycles. So some of those things are alternatives for the peak load. certainly, but we were more focused on just the overall level of resources.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would say that you can trade new firm for pumped. I don't think those are equivalent. So
yeah,
I think more it's just the location. I'm not sure that the location that we modeled the firm incremental resources that could be equivalent for geothermal or pumped hydro. So it sounds like that's a very specific asset. So I don't know that we were trying to model any particular project. That's probably the best answer.
Okay, thank you. Then Deb, if we could move on to slide 33. There's a specific question here. So transmission additions deliverability on the western slope, a question about why the May Valley Lamar tie might help for the western slope.
Oh, yeah, that's a typo.
Okay, thank you. And then why don't we spend the majority of our time on slide 34? This is where the team would most like feedback. Deb, if I could ask you to advance one on transmission solutions. So I do see hands coming up. So let's talk through some the portfolio here that the team has put forward. Scott, if you want to start, and then Tyler, I'll come on to you second.
Thanks, Kathy. Just a clarifying question, Tom, and excuse me if I missed it. Is the May Valley Longhorn extension that's considered in the CPP, is that already in the base case, or is that an alternative being considered here?
Well, so sorry, the May Valley to Longhorn is in the model, and it's kind of hard on this map because we had to pencil in the CPP, but there is if there's not, there should already be a line down to Longhorn. And so that alternative there would be, okay, if you were to shift a significant portion of the generation at May Valley down to Longhorn. Now, I mean, it's double circuit 345, so it's pretty beefy the way it's planned. But if it was even more than that, that's why there's a dash line, is there might be a level there where you would need to build additional transmission there. Or, and I mean, you didn't show every alternative here, but another option for that dashed red line would be, that could be another way to get transmission out of the state into New Mexico. So we show a dash line up to May Valley, Lamar area, but that line could also be, kind of tilted down to that Longhorn area as well.
Okay, so the dash line is above and beyond what's already in the CPP.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, we for the 10-year and the 20-year model, we assumed that Longhorn was there.
Thank you. Tyler?
Great. Thank you, Kathy, and thanks, Tom, for this overview. I think I have like a bigger question about the alternative projects, but one thing that I kind of want to ask about right now is you kind of mentioned how some of these alternative projects will accommodate interstate transmission build. Are you planning on like quantifying that in any way, or is it going to be more holistic about, hey, like you could build this project and this would potentially enable the development of another project that would expand the interstate transmission capacity in New Mexico? Am I making sense there? Like, is it going to be holistic or quantitative? And to kind of provide a little bit more details there.
I think for sure holistically. I think if we can actually, ideally, we try to quantify that as well. I don't want to overcommit at this point because we're kind of coming to the end, but we did, think that we could at least do a holistic view of that and hopefully maybe provide a little bit on the quantitative as well.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful, and I'm really happy to see this come out in the reference case here. So yeah, definitely I'll provide some more comments on that and to elaborate a little bit on what I think would be helpful for the study. But really appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tyler. On to Chris, and then we'll go to Dan next.
Yeah, on the conceptual projects, I just want to say, so the DOE did release those 10 preliminary National Electric Corridors, and 3 of them go through Northeast New Mexico. So some of these conceptual projects that we're seeing, like the May Valley to Gladstone and Comanche to Gladstone 345, yeah, that would probably align with those ideas there. In terms of how that may play out once you get, past the Colorado border into New Mexico. I know El Paso has transmission constraints, right? This is more of an interregional one. So if you continue to Gladstone down to El Paso system to 345, I'm sure they'd be very appreciative. And then potentially going west from Gladstone towards Taos, double circuit 345 or some ideas. But I would at least take advantage of those corridors that they're considering.
Thank you. Dan, and then I do have a question in the chat we want to finish up with.
Yeah, and forgive me if you discussed this, Tom, and I missed it, but in the Denver metro area, I think you alluded to Excel leading a study of deliverability there from the Colorado Power Pathway, and if memory serves, they're looking at projects that add up to about $1.4 billion there. So my question is, what assumptions did you make about what Excel has at least put on the table in the Denver metro area? Did you include any of that in your modeling, or do you assume none of it exists?
I don't know that there are any results yet. If there are, for us to include. So we just kind of overlooked issues that we saw in the metro area.
Thank you.
Okay, so from the chat, Harold is asking about environmental impacts of the transmission solutions. How have those been considered?
Again, that's some feedback that we're looking for. When we do a planning study like this, we're just drawing lines on a map based on the results that we had. So I think those, tables that followed that, where we were looking at, potential alternatives and solutions for transmission bills such as these would be very helpful.
Thank you. And Mark Detsky.
Yes. Hello. Greetings, Tom.
Greetings, Mark.
I am just curious, are you saying that on this slide, when you put in the solid blue lines, the model solved? Or is it that it's solved when you put in the blue and the red? Or is it when you just skip over problems in Denver Metro, you never had a model solve?
So these are the lines that we developed to get each of the deliverability models to solve.
Each
just to be clear, Tom, so it's the blue and the red. Right?
Yes, it's the blue and the red.
The solid blue and the red, but we do not require the dashed lines, Mark. Those are kind of optional or conceptual for different, just as it says, greater than forecasted levels of resource deployment. They may be needed if we build out interstate connections, or they could be alternatives to some of the lines that we've drawn. So the red, the dash lines are not required. The solid lines are, but we're not trying to resolve all the issues in the Denver metro area, because one of the goals of the study was not to replicate other planning processes. And it was well understood by our team when this work kicked off that PSCO is looking into that. So we've mentioned that we're not kind of targeting an expansion plan in that area. Does that get to your question, Mark?
Yes, it does. And were you saying that when I think you said that it's solving like on a per zone basis, or is it solving across the state?
So again, we started out with the deliverability study where we're going zone by zone. We did not specifically evaluate the metro zone. So that's the one zone that we did not evaluate, but we did zone by zone. So now that we have this build out, we're putting that all into a common case where we'll do the same evaluation, but on a statewide basis.
Thank you. Got it.
And Mark, we don't feel that the portfolio will change that much. in response to that study, because from what we've seen, the deliverability drivers of transmission expansion in Colorado are more severe than kind of system-wide operational conditions, just because of the richness of the resource zones that we're modeling. However, we're still doing the study. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Let's go on to Gilbert.
Hey, thanks, Kathy. If I could just ask a quick question. Hey, thanks, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hey, when you mentioned zonal, I don't know what slide it was, going back a couple, and maybe I missed it. Apologies. This is not all the issues that you're showing there. They're not simultaneous, or maybe they are. You can tell me, but is it, say, for instance, North Central? You're dispatching North Central high to perhaps a different zone, and then teasing out what that weak point in that particular zone is, and then taking that process and applying it in each individual zone? Or is this like one case, test case, and then all of these things pop up? Just for
No, it's exactly what you said at first, where we went zone by zone, independent of the other zones, developed, some potential solutions using that zone by zone as what we're calling deliverability. And then now we're taking that and putting it all into a case where we have all of that overlay, and we'll do an overall reliability assessment with that. But it's what you mentioned first.
And
okay, all right, thanks.
The other thing, Gilbert, just to tie this to processes and analytical methods I know you're familiar with, is we try to design the study to effectively be equivalent and comparable to like a designated network resource evaluation that PSCO would perform. In fact, we adopted a lot of the dispatch methodologies and study assumptions from that PSCO methodology, because what we wanted to do was say, okay, what would a Colorado transmission provider assess if somebody actually asked to interconnect and deliver this amount of resources from this area, right? So we tried to ground it in those actual decisionary processes to some extent. So that's what we're trying to replicate through that zonal analysis. It's not entirely made up.
I think you guys call them
no,
pockets.
No, that's not
sometimes.
Yeah, that's not right. Agreed. Yeah, and it just for the audience is that it's dependent on where you're sending it to in terms of like what sort of issues you might find. So
agreed.
Thanks,
Thank you, Gilbert.
Appreciate it.
And I'm going to pull from the chat here from Tyler. And Tyler, tell me if I don't catch this right. Transmission portfolio lines, are they going to be evaluated in the congestion issue step? So looking forward, alternative projects evaluated as we get to the transmission gap analysis.
Maybe somebody can somebody ask that? I didn't follow that one.
Yeah,
Tyler?
sorry, I'm being super clear here. I think the way I'm trying to like conceptualize this methodology is like, this is like the reliability solution to what makes the system run, but you're also going to do like a congestion analysis through a PCM, correct? And I was kind of wondering how you're going to evaluate the alternative projects, and if they are going to be evaluated in that congestion step. So I don't know how are you going to be able to judge like whether one or all of these projects, it can be like the value of that project in like the economic congestion step of the analysis. So I'm not, maybe this is, I'm not making total sense here.
I will address this momentarily when I talk about the purpose of the congestion study. But the main point to understand with that, Tyler, is we will respond to the congestion results that we observe. That's the main thing. So that would be the trigger to consider some of these alternatives in that assessment.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was trying to better understand. Thanks.
Okay, and then we have one more in the chat, and then I'd like to move us along. We will absolutely provide a chance for written comments here, and I hope that as you all consider what you've just looked at and digest it, can put some thoughts into writing as well. So if we're not able to address everything today, know that we will take a look at it in writing. So last question in the chat here, Denver Metro Zone into the Rifle Zone using an I-70, the corridor for a transmission addition. Did the team take a look at that?
We, like I said, on the western side, we didn't see a lot of issues over there. And so we didn't see any drivers for, transmission along that I-70 corridor. We did, start to uncover some issues, along the northern part of Toad 5 from Craig down to Blue River. But, based on what we've seen with San Luis Valley and what's needed there, the potential for an alternative there was really just from Montrose over to Poncha versus trying to build something down I-70.
Thank you. And last question here, preliminary cost, what was used? Gilbert, they based it on the MISO cost estimates. All right.
I think that's what you guys use.
Why don't we move on to our next section? This is on the scenarios. I know there's quite a bit of feedback from this of what were the assumptions that the team landed on for the 3 scenarios. So I will hand it back to the modelers.
Yeah, I'll be covering this one, and the short answer is it's a work in progress, and which for the most part is fine schedule wise, because we kind of need to finalize that transmission portfolio that Tom was talking about before we can do too much here. Because in largely these scenarios are designed to assess how that build out might change. We're not trying to redesign the grid. We're trying to understand, do we need more or less transmission capacity in certain areas in response to these scenarios? So I'll get to those momentarily, but per Tyler's question, this will give me a chance to talk about the congestion assessment, which admittedly we have not talked about in detail because it's kind of the last step of the study. So that's why. And I'm going to do that now. So go to the next slide, please. So this is an overview of the study process. So we're kind of down. Do you see this arrow below the reliability issues box? So that's the narrative that Tom just gave you. And then we're in this kind of stakeholder engagement box where we're kind of iterating and refining that portfolio of transmission solutions. And you'll note this arrow that kind of swings back up into the production cost modeling. That arrow is really important because what the production cost modeling does is it bakes in this transmission portfolio. And the reason it does that is because we're trying to identify what transmission congestion remains on the system after incorporation of that reliability driven set of transmission upgrades, and how severe is that congestion and is it worth mitigating. So that's an important principle to understand, just to start on why things are flowing the way they are. Like why, we're not sitting on our hands waiting to do this work because we're just not wanting to do it. It's because it makes logical sense to sequence these studies in this way. So that's the first thing I wanted to express. So what we'll do is we'll identify some congestion issues, kind of have a similar process. We'll say, hey, we're seeing these issues. Here's projects we propose. It very well could be that as far as intrastate transmission is concerned, we see no congestion. That could be the case. In large part, it makes sense that the reliability issues should also kind of mitigate a lot of the congestion you would see. I think that's unlikely, but it could happen. What I think is even more unlikely is that we don't see some congestion on the seams between Colorado and other markets. The reason I think that is because we know just by the makeup of the system we've built in Colorado, there's going to be times when Colorado is short generation, meaning the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining and the state is trying to import power, or the system might be long generation and the state will try to be export power. In both cases, it is true that we'll see congestion and we can respond to it. So this really is getting to the interstate components of the analysis that everybody's been so anxious to get, that we've been kind of waiting to get to. So go to the next slide. And I think this covers what I've been speaking to. The goal is to identify the potential for transmission congestion in Colorado and between Colorado and neighboring markets. We'll identify transmission upgrades that can improve the efficient flow of power within Colorado and enhance interchange. So again, we're not coming to this study with a clear view that we have to fix anything. We'll respond to the levels of congestion that we see. So go to the next slide. So this kind of lays out everything I just said. It's written down. So a couple things. We'll be looking at congestion costs, congestion hours, the size of the congested elements that will be kind of tell us where we want to focus first. And then we'll look at, first of all, are there ways to change the portfolio that Tom was just talking about that'll allow us to address the reliability issues and the congestion issues? So a lot of times all we have to move is the terminus of a project, downstream a substation or two, or just add an extension, another segment that, hey, it didn't show up in the power flow analysis for some reason, but it's showing up in the congestion. Let's just expand this project. That's the first option and most obvious. The other one is, hey, do we just need an entirely new solution? One of the conceptual or alternative projects that Tom already listed that we're contemplating in the reliability environment, or is it an entirely new upgrade? So we'll do this work over the next month and a half, as soon as we converge on a starting point transmission portfolio, and we'll share the outcomes of this with you. You can see how tightly the schedule is bound for us to get to really an answer for all this work by the September timeframe. So we are very much ramping up in this area. Go to the next slide. Here's some background on the production cost model assumptions if you'd like to look at it later. Honestly, long story short, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to let you review these and provide any comments you'd like to through the written comment window that Kathy will talk about. The main thing is that we're making this model consistent with our capacity expansion modeling forecast, and also the topology is directly consistent with our power flow modeling for the state of Colorado. And then we're effectively representing the rest of the interconnection consistent with the NREL standard scenario I think it's the mid case, which is like a 95% carbon reduction across the West by 2050. So it's 85, 90% by 2045. So that's what's going on outside of Colorado. One area that we are asking for feedback is we originally proposed this reference case, which really has not mattered from a market modeling standpoint. It has not mattered until the production cost model, which is, what reflection of Colorado BEA market participation do we want? We said in stakeholder meeting number 1 a few months ago, we would assume all Colorado BEAs are in the SPP RTO. And that's what we will plan to do unless we hear feedback that's really convincing otherwise. But I just wanted to note that's what we would start with. And then also we'd like some impact on where should we draw the rest of the Western seams, meaning, how big of a market footprint should we assume? I'll be honest that it really doesn't matter too much. It'll matter a little bit in terms of the dispatch we get, but most of the congestion we see in these studies is big enough and severe enough that it occurs regardless of market structure. One little side note that I'll get to is that we really also need to be thoughtful about planning transmission to address market seams, because the durability of that transmission congestion is questionable, right? If it's something that is just completely a forecast at this time. So, all right, go to the next slide. And I'm going to move into a discussion on scenarios. So here's an overview of the scenarios we have. We have 3. I've been talking about these a little bit. I'm going to go into a little more detail now and get through this quickly since we are getting a little short on time. Next slide. So the first scenario is the regional integration scenario. John mentioned, one component of this analysis is the SPP wind integration piece. We're wanting feedback on what we should look at for a transmission perspective, right? On how that wind gets to the Colorado system. That's going to impact our transmission analysis. So we are asking stakeholders for feedback in that area. That's key to our conclusions about how 2 gigawatts of SPP wind may or may not impact the Colorado system. So upgrade to existing ties, new DC line, whatever, interested in your feedback. The other component of this study, again, we're trying to kind of answer a lot of questions here, is the interstate constraints. What we're going to do with the PCM is relax some of these interstate interfaces or constraints. Think tote 3, right? We can just do a proxy model by increasing the limits, but what we want to know is what interstate upgrades would we want to characterize in the report as options to address these, right? We talk about the Gladstone line already. We're aware of those. Tote 3 upgrades, an obvious one, and obviously maybe a Craig to Mona line. Those are the 3 that we've thought about, but if there's others that we should take into account when we say, hey, here are options that If it looks like increasing interstate capacity is useful, here's the options that you have. And then finally, this market impact study, which people were interested in understanding how changes in markets could impact the transmission expansion. Goes back to my first comment on the last slide is, just confirm with us the market framework we should be assuming, but also confirm with us, I'm a little concerned about how we can generate durable transmission investment outcomes based around market seams. And so I really want to understand more about from the stakeholders that asked for this study, because I'm frankly having a hard time thinking about how we might characterize the results, which I like to understand before we get there. And what the undertone of that is that I don't think it's entirely responsible to say, hey, build this transmission upgrade because we observe this congestion between market seams if those seams are hypothetical in nature, or maybe in different locations and may or may not come to pass, or could change because the utility decides to change the market that they participate in, right? So those are concerns I have. So I'm just trying to think through how to frame that analysis up. So more feedback on that is definitely invited. That's the regional integration study. So that's a hodgepodge analysis because we got so many diverse views. So we're kind of bundling 3 analyses together. The next slide, please, is the high demand scenario. John asked you the areas that we want feedback in here: modeling of the firm resources. How much should we assume? We have a sensitivity where we've locked that in at 3 gigawatts, and then we have one where we've opened it up. That has a big impact on the renewable build, which will have a big impact on the transmission build. So what should we assume there? And what should we assume for the location of those resources? We're going to map them in a similar methodology as the reference case. Should we put some of them out of state or not? Is areas where we'd like some feedback. That'll impact the transmission assessment. Next slide. And finally, the extreme events scenario. So we got a lot of great stakeholder feedback here. I'm not going to enumerate it. It's listed here. But the general sense we got is there was the most interest in transmission reliability driven outages during a polar vortex event, primarily at night, right? That's what kind of they all tend to coalesce around. So what we have here is the methodology that we are proposing to adopt. So it'll be a power system analysis, a power flow analysis, where we'll adjust the demand and try to take into account some future electrification of heating loads, reflect that level of demand, assess generator availability during that condition based off of outage rates observed during other similar cold weather events. Obviously zero solar and probably zero energy storage dispatch. We can probably assume it's used up by the middle of the night. We want feedback from Colorado utilities on what kind of pre-contingency transmission outages we may want to assume due to icing events. Should we derate some of the paths? What factors should we consider under this extreme scenario? And then we'll also limit imports based off of a review of interchange data during extreme events. So we'll kind of say, hey, historically, during these types of conditions, Colorado BAs are only importing this amount, and we'll constrain the power flow model to that. And we'll perform contingency analysis of a hypothetical incremental outage and evaluate what our risk of criteria violations are and corresponding load shed events, which would be maybe a way to mitigate those aside from building a transmission line. And so we might find that our transmission portfolio is insufficient for these types of events, right? These are really hard to characterize as, hey, build a line for this one event we made up, right? But at the same time, it's really critical information the industry is moving towards. So we think at this point, providing the information and insight is a good place to start. And then there'll be conversations about how much weight and meaning it likely has. So that's our current proposal. And like I said, it kind of ran out of time today, so I probably can't take a lot of feedback on it now, but that's why we have the comment period, is to collect some of that. So Kathy, go to the next slide. Great. I'll pass it back to you.
Sure, yeah, so we have just a few minutes here, and why don't I start with what's in the chat. Clarification on the MISO cost estimator, just pointing out that may have been used in other planning efforts, but was not included in the PSCO 120-day report. So just feedback for the team to note. And then moving on to Matthew's comment, during extreme weather, duration plays a factor. 4-hour solar paired with batteries versus an 8-hour standalone may show different value. So depending on the duration of the storage asset. All right, I'll open it up to questions, maybe focus this time on the scenario assumptions, if there are some immediate reactions or feedback. Market framework, interstate connection constraints, the seams assumptions, amount of the firm resources and location.
Yeah, that's great, Kathy. Because we're almost out of time. So
Sure.
people definitely submit the written comments. They've been really helpful to date. It has changed what we've been doing. So I hope we've demonstrated that. You know, we've completely changed course in a few areas based off that. So we'll plan to keep trying to do that when it makes sense.
Great. As Keegan said, there's a lot of information here. So I'm sure as you all percolate on it, more to come. So why don't we keep going and we can wrap up and next steps, Keegan?
Yeah, so this is the list we have. It's kind of getting a little crazy here at the end. So finalize the assessment that Tom mentioned. So we really want your feedback on, you know, the needs, the solutions we see. We'll present a kind of final reference case portfolio in July. It's not going to be, hey, just build all these lines and that's it. It is definitely going to be, if more or less things happen in this area, these are additional lines or fewer lines. So it's gonna capture some uncertainty. So for people looking for a hard and fast plan, it's gonna have some lines on the map, but they're going to be sensitive to the assumptions. So just keep that in mind. But that will be final at that time. We'll have a draft congestion or interchange assessment, where I'll share results and observations and recommendations we have from the methods I just went over on the congestion study. And we'll compile some, hopefully most of the scenario analyses by that time. I think there's some that we'll be able to finish by then, and the rest will come later. After that, we're working towards a draft report in September. And then we'll be giving kind of an update initial report to the Colorado PUC in August. And then we'll be trying to finalize all this again by kind of late September with the final report sometime in October. And then I guess by January, this has to go in front of the Colorado legislature for the statute that mandated the study. So that'll happen sometime in there. So yeah, so the asks have been made, I think, and then Kathy's still your person for collecting the comments.
And then Deb, I think there's one more slide there. Just to reiterate, so we have our, as far as communications, do take some time on the webpage. There's quite a bit posted there at this point. We will get both this presentation and a recording from today posted there shortly. And then the input that Keegan just ran through, we've put it into 3 different categories: the reliability assessment and preliminary transmission portfolio. So that's slide 34, where we spent quite a bit of time today. Then details that Keegan just ran through on the modeling approach. So the high demand, the extreme event, and the market integration, those 3, some of the details that Keegan just stepped through of providing feedback for the team so they have more specifics to work with. And then the high level assumptions for production cost modeling that will be coming. So my email is there. Please send it to me by June 4th. Recognize this is a holiday weekend. We'll get everything posted as soon as we can, and look forward to getting written comments then. And our last stakeholder meeting before we get to the draft report will be in July. Look for an email from me scheduling that with a clear date. So appreciate everybody's time and input. Really good discussion going back and forth. And as the team has said repeatedly, it's been very constructive and helped direct the course of this study. So please take the time and give us some feedback at this point, because we are at that level of nailing down the transmission solutions. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good holiday weekend.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.